something close to what used to be called the voucher system in the 1980s. It would be different, but it would, it would have a lot of the characteristics of such a system. I think one area which is going very well is, pretty well, is this idea that of welfare reform. The latest DWP figures show that there's 5.7 million adults in the UK who are on out-of-work benefits. And I think that's a key horrifying statistic. That's a real rate of unemployment, or at least that's a real rate of unemployment of people who are actually on benefits. And there needs to be an even faster move in that direction. Eventually, I think we need to completely overhaul the entire tax system. I think we've got an incredibly complicated, incredibly complex, incredibly anti-work and anti-effort tax system that needs to be basically completely scrapped and replaced by a complete alternative based on simplicity, flatness, and the principle that income should only be taxed once, not huge numbers of times as it trickles through the system. That's just, even for me, I know that's not going to happen next year or the year after, but I think that's an essential long-term plan to make the economy more competitive and boost long-term growth. And now, on to the last set of fantasy land reforms that I advocate, and that's changes to demand management and macroeconomic policy. I think we need new fiscal rules. I think these new fiscal rules should first start off by having new accounting systems for the UK government. I think there should be full transparency. Everything should be on the balance sheet, and we should have the same sort of rules for the government as for private companies. And then I think you should have new fiscal rules with putting in place a target for public spending as a share of GDP. I mean, that would actually be the best kind of target rather than a debt target or even a deficit target. Because ultimately I think what needs to be controlled is public spending, and if public spending is controlled, the rest generally is okay. And then I think we need a new monetary policy in the UK. I think we tried consumer price inflation targeting. We've tried that measure, it didn't work. It allowed a massive bubble to develop in asset prices during the noughties. And to be honest, it seems that we never learned the lessons of how money works and how macroeconomic cycles take place. Throughout history there's been monetary policy driven bubbles. I think what we saw in the last few years was one such. But to be honest, the Lawson boom in the 1980s was another. The secondary banking crisis problems in the 1970s was another. The 1920s boom, which led to the 1930s recession, was another, and so on. And I very firmly believe that we need a new kind of macroeconomic understanding of how the world works, which puts money and liquidity at the centre of it, and just looks at how that drives economic fluctuations. And I just think that the current CPI targeting policy of the Bank of England doesn't work and needs to be scrapped. There needs to be a different model. Their main mission ought to be to target some kind of loose measure of liquidity, I think. Because what counts is liquidity. What a central bank should be doing is achieving monetary neutrality. It is to basically create an environment whereby people can transact and go and do their business and save and invest and so on without massive distortions. The job of the Bank of England should not be to be hyperactive. It shouldn't be to constantly try and create growth out of nowhere. It should be to just ensure stability. And what matters is the overall liquidity, because just consumer prices are not the be and end all. Asset prices are really, really important too. And it's very hard to target asset prices because you don't really know, whether they should be going up or down. So I think some sort of measure of liquidity in the economy would be the best way forward. And so I think there should be radical change in macroeconomic policy. I think all of our efforts since the recession have been on banking reform. We've completely forgotten about what I think is a much greater issue, which is macroeconomic stability. I think the boom was a macroeconomic failure of central banks in the West, central banks in the East, and a global liquidity bubble caused by errors in economic policy for the last 20 years at least. And I think we still are very much in this massive bubble globally. Governments are borrowing at less than 2% for 10 years. I think that's completely insane, and at some point it's going to change. And when this bond bubble bursts, there's going to be a catastrophic price to pay. And until we understand the big context of all of this, We just can't have an economic policy that's good for growth in the long run. I mean, traditionally, Britain's had a very poor macro policy. UK had a good micro policy in the 80s and 90s, and a terrible macroeconomic policy in the late 80s, and then with the IM and all that sort of stuff. And the conceit of the Gordon Brown years was to think that the macroeconomic policy was actually right, where it was completely wrong. And it needs to change. And, you know, in terms of, so that's sort of in a way where I think the debate should go next. I think we need to completely change our macroeconomic policy. I think in terms of other areas of reform, we need to create a new PFI, a new way of involving the private sector to finance big infrastructure projects that doesn't rip off the taxpayer. The previous system didn't really work in that respect and was used as a mechanism to put liabilities off the balance sheet. But I think there needs to be a lot more investment in infrastructure, especially in transport, but also in energy and other things. And the private sector needs to pay for that somehow. And we need to find new mechanisms to allow this. So that's about it for the moment. Howard told me be radical, so I thought, okay, I'll come up with something that can be implemented in a few weeks by determined government. But look, really, I think our choice, you know, I think we're facing a really important choice here. Either weak, sluggish growth and managed decline, or real change. And obviously what I'm saying is going to sound way too radical for the governments, and most of it's never going to be implemented, and people will laugh at me when I call for it. But the point is, actually, there's no choice really, because what's going to happen to this coalition if there's actually no growth next quarter, or maybe even a shrinking economy, and then no growth next quarter, and a very weak economic performance over the next 2-3 years, and all the targets aren't met, and the deficit is too big, and there's no growth, there's no jobs. What's going to happen to this government? Well, it's going to be in crisis. And, you know, people are going to be very angry. They're going to blame someone for this, bankers or cuts or something. And, you know, I really think this is an urgent situation. We have a very difficult situation ahead of us. The economy needs to grow more for the sake of people who live in this country, for the sake of the people who are out of work and who are struggling every day with their lives. So the government needs to act. The government needs to be radical. I think it's in the interest of the country and in its own self-interest.
Thank you very much, Alistair. Can I just briefly comment? I don't think you are radical enough. It seems to me what's going on in the world is natural arbitrage between the up-and-coming economies, the BRICS, and the mature economies. It's unstoppable. Now, I've just been in India for a week. I was amazed there 3 years ago. The living standards of the middle classes in Bombay and Delhi are as good as here or better. Now, what seems to me to be wrong is that we've still got this illusion that we're miles ahead of these countries. The fact of the matter is we have to have the natural forces that drive an economy. And what's missing if you have welfare spending of 220 billion, if you have no motivation for people to get skilled, if bluntly there is no stick as well as carrot, if you can have 10% of the population doing nothing for 2 or 3 generations, how can this economy go forward? To be vital, we've got to learn some lessons from India and China and Brazil. That deals with tax, regulation and everything else. What on earth are we doing having tax credits, minimum wages and the rest of it? You're going to just go downhill as an economy with all of that. So I think there's got to be considerably more radical change in order to compete with the part of the world that we're competing with, if we're going to have a successful future.
I don't disagree with what you said, but basically, I think ultimately the problem is that we haven't woken up to the nature of the challenge. And when I mean we, I mean as a society, we just haven't. So therefore, this is the reason why I was being slightly less radical than you were, because, but I think ultimately, unless there's drastic change, we will just fall behind and fall behind and fall behind. And to me, it goes further than just the Asian situation and the emerging markets and so on. I think it's simply that, you know, I think for many years, I think the debt-fueled consumption spree and the bubble was so pernicious because it just made people live substantially higher standards of living than they could actually afford for a very long time. And debt is about bringing forward consumption that normally would be in the future. And some of that's good. It's very good to have some debt. There wasn't enough debt in this country for many years, but then suddenly went too far. And too much consumption was brought forward, and unfortunately we're now in the future and there's nothing left to eat. So that's the lesson that people need to learn, I think.
Yes.
Just stand up.
Okay,
Bernard Herman, thanks so much for an excellent lecture. I very much appreciate all your articles over the years. Please ask you two short questions. Firstly, are there any arguments for Britain's continued membership of the European Union? And furthermore, if my memory is correct, since 1909, I think it was called the Osborne Judgment, trade unions have been legally exempt from the economic damage that they cause when they go on strike. Is there a good argument that we're probably going to have a lot of strikes coming up, especially in the public sector, for ending that immunity and making unions responsible for the damage that they cause?
On the first question about the European Union, I think as it currently stands, the costs of EU membership are almost certainly greater than the benefits. Now, I'd love to see a proper sort of cost-benefit analysis being conducted into that, though I mean people have attempted to do that in the past, of course. I just can't see how the costs cannot be much greater than benefits. That said, there are benefits. So, you know, I just think the current relationship and the current balance of costs and benefits is completely wrong and is not sustainable and has to change. So I'm slightly sitting on the fence there. But the reason I'm sitting on the fence is I don't think that the question is, should we quit the EU or stay in the EU? I think there's an opportunity to change our relationship and basically massively move powers out of the EU and back into the UK. Somehow or another we need to move in that direction. I'm not too bothered exactly what the final outcome is. I do think though that it's going to be much harder than people realise this, just because the power of the vested interest is so great. As to your second question,
Trade union immunity.
yes, I mean, I think the sorts of, I think some slightly more moderate changes to the rules would be enough to reduce quite substantially the number of strikes and so on. So, as a realistic solution, I'd go for what I advocate. But I mean, obviously, I know the point I'm making.
Sorry, Tim Guinness. We know that one of the problems is that central government expenditure rose, as you described, from 36 to 51%. We also know that quite a part of that was because the standard of living, or the wages enjoyed, the earnings enjoyed by the public sector, went up relative to the private sector. I don't understand why there isn't more talk of dealing with part of our problem by actually putting an across-the-board 5% cut, rather as the Irish have done.
Absolutely.
And I would then add to that, extending VAT to food. There will be a very significant tax income from that, and we've got an obesity problem, actually, not a shortage.
I mean, on the idea of should there have been wage cuts in the public sector, it would have been an easier and less painful solution than firing 500,000 people, of course, or whatever the end result's going to be. Nonetheless, there's also a problem of excessive number of people being employed in the public sector. I think we missed a trick or two when it, as a country a year and a half ago, and I think that sounds like quite a good idea to me. I don't agree with the VAT on food point here. I don't think we should do it.
At the back, glasses.
When you talk about there being too much debt in the economy, there's really three types of debt: consumer debt, there's corporate debt, and there's government debt. I'm assuming when you say there's too much debt, you're talking largely about consumer debt and government debt, or are you also including corporate debt within that?
I think there's four kinds of debt in a way, because you could divide corporate debt between into two kinds. There was a lot of extra leverage created by very over-leveraged financial institutions at one point. That's diminished quite a lot. So that sort of artificially boosted some of the measures of debt. But that was only a few institutions and so on. I think primarily the problem right now in the UK is consumer and government debt and some residual over-leverage.
Before I put my question, let me say I agree with just about everything you said. My questions are constructive or negative. The assume that there was great support for all the ideas you expounded on today. What about the political situation? Can you see this being feasible with the current coalition government, for example? Or do we need a majority Conservative administration to see it through? This is the problem. I mean, I can't see it happening.
I was saying earlier, sort of as a preface to everything I said, I was quite depressed about things, and I alluded to the fact that I thought I was being widely over-radical given the current situation, which is why I didn't go as far as Howard might have wished me to go. I personally don't think most of this can happen. But I think it's partly due to the coalition, yes, which of course came about because the Conservatives lost the last election.
Didn't win.
Yes. I'd call it lost, but anyway.
Labour lost even more.
True, but still, it wasn't the best performance ever from the Conservative Party. So I think that's a major issue, but I think ultimately it's also, it's not only that, right? I mean, you know, a lot of these views are not entirely widespread among the upper echelons of the current Conservative Party. Also, of course, they'll be highly unpopular among the country. I mean, there's no doubt about that. Which is, by the way, why I think that at least politicians who agree with these kinds of ideas should be much more vocal.
Allister, Michael Forsyth, just on that particular point about it being unpopular in the country, isn't one of the problems that every time a government minister talks, he talks about the deficit and not the debt? And out there in the country, and actually quite a few members of Parliament, I discover, people think that reducing the deficit is reducing the debt rather than reducing the rate at which the debt is growing. Now, if people don't understand the point that you made in your speech, that the debt is going to be 50% larger at the end of this Parliament, despite what we're told about austerity and everything else, then how on earth can we get them to buy into the kinds of policies that you're... And there's been a kind of conspiracy between all the political parties not to explain to the country the depth of our problem. And the first thing you have to do if you're going to make a change is to understand that you have a problem. And I read your articles every morning and they're fantastic. But you seem to be one of the few people who are actually spelling out as it is. And in order to carry out your programme, which I think is absolutely excellent, all governments have to have consent. And to get consent, you need to tell people how it is. What can we do about this?
Yes, I mean, there was an interesting Comrades poll asking the public what they thought was going to happen to the national debt over the next 4 years or something. And they said, is it going to go up by, a few $100 billion? Is it going to stay the same, or is it going to fall? And the overwhelming majority of the public said it was going to fall, and only 9% thought it was going to go up. So basically, 91% of the population got it wrong. It doesn't understand at all what's going on with something that's very, very important. So that's a disaster. A disaster that's fueled in part by problems with financial literacy in the UK and general education problems, which are I think a major disaster. But also the government, I think it's the government also have been much clearer about this. And it's still time for it to change. In order to change its entire vocabulary, explain these things all the time, explain that it's adding 130 billion or 120 billion pounds to the national debt this year, that it has to find people out there to actually lend us 120 or 130 billion pounds, and that's really difficult, and so on and so forth, and make all these changes. But ultimately, it was going back to part of the point I was making before. It's been years that it's been years since the moral and positive and economic case for a smaller government, greater individual responsibility, lower taxes, and so on and so forth, was made publicly and as a main driving force by the Conservative Party, or at least by the leadership of the Conservative Party. And I think that's a major issue, and I think it helps to explain the slow leftward drift of this country, because you don't actually have a political party that's putting political capital on the line to make these kinds of arguments. You've only got a very defensive set of views. We have to cut spending, we don't really want to, we have to, because otherwise we'll go bankrupt. And those sorts of arguments. They work in the very short term, but in the long term they are just fueling discontent. And I think, I just think that the whole mindset has moved in the wrong direction. So I'm probably not answering your question, but of course I agree that consent is necessary. But I think you can create consent. I think the big mistake is to think that politicians need to take public opinion as a constant or given, rather than try and change public opinion. I think that's a number one. They should be trying to change public opinion. And of course, they should have spent years before, when Gordon Brown was in office, trying to change public opinion. Then they didn't, of course, which was a major issue, and we're still paying the price for that. But now they should try and change opinion.
Do you think that the bailed out banks should be forced by government to lend to small businesses? Because I can't see if business can't perform because they haven't got sufficient amount of cash. I mean, how on earth can the economy grow? Because at this moment the banks are sitting on all this money that they're lending to businesses.
I mean, I'm sceptical about that view. I agree that there is less credit. Clearly, there's much less credit around the economy, and it's much more pricey and so on. I'm just a natural sceptic of the view that if just there was some law saying banks should all lend to small businesses big. I mean, I'd go out and borrow £100 million tomorrow, and I want a cover-like loan, please, like I could get 5 years ago, and I'll go and set up some business, right? So clearly, there's an issue there. Now, clearly, if you're getting banks to hold much more capital and much more liquid capital, you know, that's why they're sitting on money. They have to sit on money by law, basically. So there's an issue there. Now, you know, is the situation? I basically don't think there should be. I don't think it's as major an issue as most people think. And I think there's been. I think it's at least fair to say that a large part of the problem is reduced demand for loans because of uncertainty and worries and so on. So I don't buy basically that there's a massive total credit drought. And I don't buy that that's the reason why we're in such trouble. Now, I'm willing to accept there are some problems, but I just don't think it's as important an issue as everybody thinks.
Bernard,
Can I just say one last thing? By the way, I think that instead of constantly trying to boost credit to small businesses, we should try and boost equity. So I think it's also part of this business of moving away from a debt-based economy. So you could, for example, have major fiscal incentives for much more VC and financing of smaller firms in that way and so on. But I'm quite worried about the idea that you're going to have this corporate easing thing. This corporate easing thing sounds to me like a recipe for disaster. I mean, I think, I can't remember who said recently, if you think the banks are bad at lending money, wait until the government lends money. That's my worry.
Can I ask you to make a bit of a forecast? Because basically I think the worse it gets, the more optimistic we should be, on the principle that it's more likely that things are going to change. And I don't think it's impossible that this coalition will go for a dramatic change of policy if it thinks it's the only way it's going to survive. Yeah. And I don't think it's tenable for the Prime Minister to keep saying the coalition agreement is the ultimate national interest when ultimately the coalition agreement will be compromising our other national interests like economic growth. Now, growth is the crunch. I mean, if none of these policies that you've outlined today are put into effect, and we remain shackled to the low-growth, high unemployment economic bloc, which is the European Union, and, as is likely, the euro crisis grinds on and on and on, because the only way out is likely to be an orderly breakup of the euro. What is the prospect for economic growth, and what are the consequences for the fiscal deficit and unemployment, and could we get through to 2015 on this policy?
I mean, that is exactly. I mean, politically, that is actually what I think the most powerful point is. It's not so much that people don't like these policies; they don't like them. But the problem is, what's the alternative? If the alternative is growth that's much too weak, and job creation that's much too low, and the Chancellor failing to meet his budget deficit forecasts and everything just unravelling, I would bet against the coalition surviving, personally. I just don't know how many quarters of zero growth it would take to send the whole thing into a state of crisis, and for, Ed Ball's increasingly strident sort of appearances on TV to actually start convincing a lot of people. So I think they have to do something to boost growth, and what they have to do has to be on the supply side of the economy, not on the demand side. I mean, they've already done QE now, or going to do QE, and then now corporate easing on the demand side. But I think, to me, that's a distraction. What matters is supply side reforms.
As time is running, could I just ask everyone to say their piece briefly, and then perhaps Ferris will sum up at the end. So first of all, yeah.
Hi. One of the areas that many people think is ripe for a root and branch reform is the UK's incredibly complex tax code. You are the chairman of the Institute of Directors and Taxpayers Alliance 2020 Tax Commission. What impact do you think that will have on public debate?
Well, I hope it will have a massive and major transformative impact. I'm not entirely certain it will, but I very much hope it will, and I will do my best for it to have that impact. And what I'm doing is chairing this commission, which in a way is a successor to Law for Science, wonderful work of a few years ago. And we are working towards a completely new tax system, which basically tears up virtually everything that currently is, and sort of moves the whole thing towards a system where income is only taxed once, as much as possible, rather than repeatedly. That's very, very clear, and so on and so forth. So that's going to we're going to publish a massive book, basically, and various other things at some point in the new year. I think that's a long-run project. I think that's desperately important, and you could actually gain a huge amount of growth and efficiency just by changing this monstrous tax system that we've got. I mean, it's just so horrible and so complicated and so unfair. And large chunks of it don't work. Corporation tax system doesn't work. You know, there's double and triple and quadruple taxing of income. So I think that's a very, very important set of reforms for the medium term.
John Woodman, Alistair, I just want to follow up on your full science point, because I just wonder whether it's useful to put figures to this. Because if you look at where this government came in terms of about £800 billion in national debt, if the scenario plays out and it's a good one, it'll be 1.4 trillion by the time it's finished. And we know that two major IMF previous economists have suggested that a country can't grow under those circumstances. And I just wonder how important it is to get the figures out there. For example, if you go to your Eurozone problem, on the 18th of July, in the Wall Street Journal, it transpired that the European stress tests of their banks turned out that there was $8 or $9 trillion of debt. 2 or 3 trillion of that turns out to be American debt. Now, you know, how do you overcome that problem? How can you not but socialise?
Well, I mean, the Eurozone issue is a major one. But just first, going back to very quickly, because we won't have time to see. But the first point, clearly, when you've got massive amounts of debt, national debt, government debt, that reduces growth. That's what the research shows. Just in the same way that you've got a massive state, which is bigger than half the economy, that reduces growth. Just in the same way that when you've got very high marginal tax rates, and the whole thing combined with a high rate of inflation, that reduces growth. That's why the challenge is massive, basically, because some things are just going in such a wrong direction, and in a way that you can do nothing about, other than trying to sort of eventually stop the damage, such as with the increased national debt, that we're bound to have weak growth, or a lot of forces weaken growth, which is why it's so urgent that some really, really radical supply-side action be taken to try and at least combat some of that.
Could I ask for remaining comments to be very brief, and Alistair to perhaps sum up at the end? So, first of all, over in that corner. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. My name is John Bullard, and I have a very, very simple question, a rather practical point, actually. You've referred to the state of entitlement, that everybody feels they're entitled to something. And one issue that no politician has yet had the guts to address is, with no disrespect to the people who work in it, is the National Health Service. I wonder who the first politician will be who will turn around and actually rename it the National Sickness Service, and then sit back and watch what will happen in terms of people looking after themselves and taking more accountability for their own future, and then the effect on the economy.
A lady in pink wanted to say something.
Thanks, yes. Andrea Ledserman, MP for South Northamptonshire. Alistair, I just wonder, what do you think about the issue around bank competition? I mean, it seems to me I'm on the Treasury Select Committee, and there's this enormous oligopoly in both the SME market and the personal current account market. Surely we need to be focusing on more entrants, and that would solve part of the problem of lack of lending.
Gentleman with the red tie.
Thank you. I think you rightly advocated that we need to be out there making the moral case for capitalism.
Yeah.
And I tweeted that out whilst you were saying it. And somebody came back with a question, which I think is quite a good one. They said, how can we make the moral case for capitalism when Osborne is advocating fiscal integration to a social democratic fiscal system for our European partners?
I think perhaps the last question there. Yes, hand up. Thank you.
Neil Collins. If the outlook is so dire, why are the markets prepared to lend seemingly unlimited amounts to the UK government at 2%?
Good question. Alistair, very briefly.
I now have to try and remember all the questions.
Absolutely.
I've forgotten them already.
Well, let's start with the last one.
Okay. I think there's a massive bubble in the bond markets, or at least in the government bond markets of the UK, Germany and America and so on, caused by a massive amount of foreign exchange reserves in Asia and the Middle East. That's part of the problem. I've got to take 1 minute to answer this, so it's quite difficult. But basically, I think that ever since the 80s, there's been massive monetary manipulation by central banks, starting by Alan Greenspan in the late 80s. I think all central bankers thought they had more power than they really had, and they constantly injected money into the economy to try and get rid of fluctuations and recessions and stock market crashes and so on. So you had that. Then you had this huge accumulation of foreign forex reserves, plus an undervalued Chinese currency, which again fueled that in Asia. And then you had all these sovereign wealth funds coming along, and you also had the Japanese situation where you had extremely low interest rates that also created liquidity via the carry trade and so on. So I think you've had years and years and years of massive liquidity. I think that's actually what caused a lot of the bubble and the problems. And I think the latest version of that, the bit of the global economy that's still completely crazy and still completely in bubble territory, is that bond market. Now there's other explanations too, of course. There's the real explanation, which is the sort of the non-financial explanation by that I mean, which is that Western economies invest much less now than they used to, so there's less demand for investable funds. And last but not least, of course, QE. You know, a lot of people have been predicting QE for the UK, so obviously that means that they're more likely to lend money to the UK. So that's some reasons, and so I don't think that justifies a sort of Keynesian argument which says we shouldn't worry about the deficit or anything of that matter. I think, in fact, it's a #1 ticking time bomb underneath the global economy.
More banking competition and national health.
In terms of more banking competition, I think actually that the best way to have massive... this is obviously a fascinating question. I'm slightly less sure than you and some of your colleagues are when it comes to the sort of lack of credit and so on and so forth. But obviously more competition will be a good thing. But I think, for me, the best way to have real competition in the banking industry is to have someone like Tesco enter really, really big time. I'm delighted there's a lot of people here are involved in new banks, new smaller banks. But I think having Tesco could have be a major player coming in and could make a lot of difference. I'm not that convinced that because I think because of how strict the regulatory system now is in terms of how much capital and liquidity every bank has to have, I feel that a lot of these banks, and not talking about the small ones necessarily, but a lot of the main ones, are going to be quite identical when it comes to the rate at which they can lend money out and so on. I think one of the side effects of having the kinds of strict regulations we're now getting in terms of capital and liquidity will be to make the banking system more homogeneous, i.e. to make them less different. They'll only be able to compete on things other than the price of credit and so on. And so they might be able to compete more on consumer service or on things like that, but less on these other issues. So to me...
and easier to move your account. Presently, anti-money laundering stuff makes it a nightmare for anyone wanting to move their account, so it sort of hits competition before it can even get provided. But
I think the one thing that ought to be done is to make bank accounts much more easily portable. I think much more so even than Vickers recommends. I think that would be I think it should be like a mobile phone, you literally move your number around. I think that would make more difference. That plus Tesco and others like that will make more difference than anything else. But it's a fascinating area. The other question was the NHS. I think long run, at some point, someone needs to accept that the financing of healthcare in this country can't come entirely from the taxpayer. Now, I love healthcare, I would like to spend 20% of my own income on healthcare. I'd like to extend my life, and I'd like to extend the life of my child and my wife and so on. So, and a lot of people feel like me. We want to spend a lot of money. We want to have nice scanners and have too many scans and all that sort of thing. There's an urge among humans, and perfectly naturally, as we get richer, we want to spend more on healthcare. So, but the percentage of GDP that would have to be accounted for by health can't be financed by the public sector forever. At some point, otherwise, you're going to end up, I think, public spending would be at 55–60% of GDP or something. So, I think the real solution with the NHS, and that's obviously completely politically impossible to discuss in this country, is to move to a completely different system, like there is in Germany or Singapore or whatever, and to have mixed financing and insurance and all that sort of stuff. But I just think that ultimately, at some point, every time governments are going to be destroyed by the fact that they're trying to keep a lid on public spending, but there's these huge pressures to spend more on healthcare.
Just before thanking you, can I just ask Tim Knox to stand up? I don't know why you weren't here, but Tim Knox has taken over CPS, as you know, and I think not everyone necessarily knows him. So thank you very much for collaborating this evening. And
thank you very much.
If you've got a burning desire to write something, you get hold of Tim.
Just so long as it adds to grace.
Exactly. Can I thank you very much indeed for a very forceful and much enjoyed talk this evening. Thank you very much.